there's an enormous difference in the dialogue that goes on among theologians of different faith traditions than prayers and meditators in different traditions. And, when you're down at the level of practice, I think, you can see much more resonance of the experience between different faith traditions than when you're just dealing at the level of doctrine.
You're listening to Find the Good News, Episode 67, The Disciple, a Beacon Series conversation featuring author of Growing in Love and Wisdom, Ignatian-trained spiritual director and retreat leader, Susan Stabile. Find the Good News is produced by Parker Brand Creative Services, a branding agency that thinks sideways, pushes forward, and gets your brand up. See what else we do at parkerbrandup.com. Thank you for seeking out good news by tuning into this podcast. Today's Beacon Series episode features my conversation with Susan Stabile. After an exodus from her Catholic upbringing, Susan spent 20 years practicing Buddhism and was ordained as a Tibetan Buddhist nun. Susan returned to the Catholic faith of her youth and now serves as a spiritual director, retreat leader, and lecturer. She wrote the book Growing in Love and Wisdom, Tibetan Buddhist Sources for Christian Meditation, a work that has become a great treasure to me in my own spiritual journey. I'm really pleased to be able to share this conversation with you. If you are an Early Riser Patreon supporter, then you'll already know that this will be the last numbered episode of 2019. I've got some really great interviews scheduled during the month of December, but I'm going to take some time away from production, using that time to reflect and be with my family. I'm sure there will be a journal episode mixed in, as well as a B-Sides episode for my Patreon supporters. But if you're a primary listener, then 67 is the official last episode for 2019. Speaking of Patreon, I have to ask you for your support. Week by week, the Good News mission is gaining new ground, but it does take a lot of work. The great thing is that I love doing it, but it does have to happen between the raindrops at Parker Brand Creative Services. If you want to help me increase the good news signal, you can do that by heading over to patreon.com/findthegoodnews. Your monthly support as an early riser patron really does help keep the good news fire burning. That's patreon.com/findthegoodnews. That's all the announcements I have today. You've made the time to listen, found a space to do the listening. You've settled your mind. You've opened your heart. Everything about these actions says you're ready to hear something that will help you on your own pilgrim's journey. So go ahead and press play on a little good news. If you listen to this show, then you've often heard me allude to a spiritual experience that took place when I was a much younger man. While I've spared the full linear details, it is sufficient to say that the experience changed my mind and gave me a reason to follow my heart. In an attempt to understand this experience of my youth, I wandered as a pilgrim, searching and studying the religions and wisdom traditions of the world. While I found treasures in many, I have never felt more at home than I have in the teachings of Jesus the Christ and Sidhartha Gautama, the Buddha. Living with one foot in each of these religions has been an enlightening journey. It has not been without its difficulties, especially in finding an organized religious tradition I could wholeheartedly call home. Regardless of this challenge, I have adopted much from the traditions of Christianity and Buddhism. While there are defined differences between them, I have found that love, mercy, compassion, kindness, and wisdom rise clearly to the top. It is from these that I arrange the bouquet of my personal spiritual practice and most of my perspectives. I feel very blessed to have been born at this time on earth. The last 3,000 years have been filled with discord, conflict, war, and violence. It has also given rise to powerful voices of unity, diversity, and harmony. In the last 100 years alone, humans have gained unprecedented access to information. Many extraordinary beings have used that information to learn, grow, and find common ground. They have focused on the beauty we share, while still remaining grounded firmly in the traditions and teachings of their unique cultures. In seeking voices such as these, I have been honored to read the works of Mohandas K. Gandhi, Walt Whitman, Ram Dass, J. Krishnamurti, Henry David Thoreau, Lao Tzu, Brother David Steindl Rast, Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet, Martin Luther King Jr., and Thich Nhat Hanh. Today, I share these names and this more extended reflection with you because it is all highly relevant to the nature of Find the Good News and my special guest. You see, recently, I added a new name to the list of wise voices I've come to treasure, and that name is Susan Stabile. I discovered Susan's work while seeking podcasters that may be discussing the writings of the Trappist monk and author Thomas Merton. I landed on a podcast called Creo en Dios, which translates, I believe in God. I do believe, so I pressed play. I listened, my mind was enlivened, my heart was opened. I pressed play again and again and again. What I found in Susan's lectures was a highly Catholic voice that seemed to dance effortlessly with teachings of other wisdom traditions. She dialed beautiful practices from Buddhism into a life of Christian prayer. Susan's lectures, of which there are over 100, became a part of my weekly spiritual life. She presented Christian teachings and scripture in a way that felt like home for me, and in all truth, the experience was very healing. Her lectures have become a part of the journey both in and out of my annual spiritual retreat, framing the beginning and the end of that yearly journey. Her book, Growing in Love and Wisdom, Tibetan Buddhist Sources for Christian Meditation, presents slightly retooled Buddhist methods for Christians or anyone seeking to deepen their existing prayer life. Discovering her work has been a treasure I did not know I was seeking. Her agreeing to visit with me on this Beacon Series episode allows that work to reverberate even further so that it may enter new hearts and minds. It is my great pleasure to send this good news beacon out to you. This is my conversation with Susan Stabile.
Wake up this morning, you're dreaming up the story. I can hear the way it's going, 'cause you're laughing in your sleep. On the path to deliverance and a holy wall of light pouring through your window.
Old news, bad news, fake news. Sometimes you want to shut those signals down and seek a better source. With my Find the Good News Beacon series, I tune into good people doing good works wherever I can find them. I scan across the full spectrum of life, seeking out human beings that have turned their dials towards helping others, aligning their time, resources, and talents with goodness, justice, mercy, and love. In each episode, I sync up with the hearts and minds of my extraordinary guests. We have dynamic conversations that invigorate the mind long after our transmission has ended. I discover the critical life experiences that shape them, the perspectives that drive them, and the fundamental beliefs that have anchored them to a path of goodness. There's a lot of background noise in the world. My name is Oran Parker, and I'm cutting through the static to find the good.
I love you just as well.
Thank you for taking the time to do this. It's honestly a big treat for me, to be honest with you.
Happy to do it.
I would love it if you don't mind, if you could, in your own words, let the listeners know who I'm talking to. That way I don't mess it up.
Well, my name is Susan Stabile. I am an Ignatian-trained spiritual director and retreat leader. My day job for many years was as a legal academic, although I've also taught in a master's in theology program at St. Catherine's University here. But now, I guess as a technical matter, I'm retired, although my husband laughs when I say that, given my schedule. But mostly what I do is spiritual direction and retreat work right now.
Okay. Well, I got to tell you, my path to you is interesting. At least for me, it's interesting. It may not be so interesting to everybody else, but I'm confirmed Catholic, but only recently in the last couple of years, and it's been sort of a strange cycle for me. I struggle with it, to be quite honest with you. I've struggled with it almost since the beginning. It's been a strange experience for me. But I come from a background, I guess I'd say, when I when I discovered your work, it was interesting. Let me just tell you, to frame this out for you. So I live in Southwest Louisiana, so we're down in the Bible Belt, right on the Gulf Coast. So I spent, 20 years or more just sort of after a spiritual experience that really changed my life. And that's the real short version of that. Most of us have some story like that.
Sure.
Without getting into the details, but it was something that really changed my life in my 20s, but it was sort of unfounded, right? There was no framework. And so when I had this sort of experience, I really didn't know what I went on sort of, I guess what you'd call a pilgrim's journey, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wanted to figure out what had happened, basically. And so I just looked everywhere. So I landed in these two, I looked at a lot of places, but I landed in sort of these two major silos of Christianity and Buddhism. Right. And for years, for me, I guess coming and going between the two and reading and studying and trying to frame out my life based on these two traditions, I felt a little homeless, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, of course.
I couldn't keep both feet in one or the other. Mm-hmm. And so I found like the language I was using would easily for me flow from one to the other, but I couldn't find conversations where I could have those kinds of talks, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway, fast forward to being 45 years old from 20-something years old, and I love Thomas Merton. Read a lot of his work. And one morning I happened to be at the gym and I was listening to podcasts and I said, I've never looked up Thomas Merton to see if anybody out there's having any conversations on podcasts about Thomas Merton. So I did a quick search, landed on Creo and Diaz, and you happened to be talking about him.
Right.
I listened to one of your talks and listened to another one. And then I listened to another one, and I told my wife,
there's about 170 of them on there. So.
Well, I'm not even done with them all. I mean, it's become your podcast, your lectures or speaking has become a really great resource for me. It's like refreshment. So I came home. I told my wife, I said, "Man, I started listening to someone that you really should listen to." And she was like, "Really?" I was like, "Oh yeah." I said, "I don't know how to tell you why. I don't know exactly. It's there's a wide berth of topics that she's talking about." I said, "But man, there's just something special in her voice, and what she's saying is just, I don't know, I feel refreshed by it." And then you happened to mention that you had been a Tibetan Buddhist nun. And I said, okay. So while you weren't talking about that, I just felt like I was picking up on some of that language, that fluidity that I had been seeking. So anyway, I'm telling you all of that to kind of segue into why I've reached out to you, because I read your book, Growing in Love and Wisdom, which was an incredible treat for me. And so I'd like to kind of dive in from there.
Sure. Yeah, and my own background, while not exactly the same as yours. I mean, I was raised as a Roman Catholic, Catholic school all my, young life, everything in our lives. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in New York City in the 60s. Everything in our life revolved around our parish, all the activities that we did. And in high school, I just gave it up. I decided I didn't believe in the Catholic Church, didn't believe in God. So I went off to college really with no spiritual life at all. I didn't at all think it was ironic that I went off to a Jesuit Catholic college despite that. But anyway, and then when I was in law school was when I was really exposed to Buddhism in a serious way for the first time and started meditating in a Buddhist center. Okay. But then I graduated from law school and went to work in a large New York City law firm, working 90 gazillion hours a week, which didn't leave too much time for meditation. Yeah. So I actually asked my law firm to send me to Hong Kong. Not that there's any active Buddhism there, but at least put me in proximity to Buddhist countries. And so spent a couple of years there and then literally quit my job and gave away just about everything. Really? And spent 2 years in Buddhist monasteries and retreat centers, including, as you mentioned, ordaining as a Tibetan Buddhist nun. I came back to the States, then still practiced Buddhism for a while, and ironically it was my daughter, at the time she was born, I was still kind of practicing Buddhism in the States. But when she was 8, she asked for Catholic religious education.
Yeah.
And that put me back in a situation where I was hearing the voice. And, like you say, you have an experience, it's hard to put into words. I mean, the short answer when people ask me about my returning to Christianity from Buddhism is, well, the Holy Spirit. I don't know what else really to say. But as you say, you're quite right. I don't call myself a Buddhist Christian or a Christian Buddhist. I mean, my spirituality is Christian and Christocentric, but there's no question that I bring back to my Christianity now a tremendous amount of what I learned and practiced as a Buddhism. And while I'm not someone that says, oh, all religions are alike, I do think there's a lot in the Buddhist tradition that is extraordinarily helpful. And that's one of the things, obviously, that led me to write the book, the meditation book.
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful book. I got to tell you a little bit, and hopefully this will create some interesting conversation for us. For me, I really never had one particular tradition that I leaned towards. Mm-hmm. I read, obviously, when you're just out there seeking, you can't help but run across the works of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalai Lama, Chogyam Trungpa, people like that. And so I was heavily influenced by a lot of those writings. And so I guess it was very strange because when someone it's very common for people here to ask you, where do you go to church? Right. And that's, for me, never been a simple answer, because in those 2 decades there, I would say, well, I don't go to church. That's the simple answer. And that creates a whole door being opened where you're being invited to different things. And I always found it was very difficult to have those talks, because when you say, well, I'm sort of without a church, but I'm studying Buddhism sort of on my own. Right. In a Christian-centric society, that's not always well received, because Buddhism is sort of alien, And I wondered if you experienced any of that type of thing when you returned to Catholicism.
And I think it's that kind of reaction may be, well, none of this is monolithic. I think you probably get some more of that reaction in conservative Protestant denominations than you do at least in certain segments of Catholic. I mean, as I say, I kind of, once I walked into a Jesuit retreat house one day and never kind of walked out of it. And there in that community, there's certainly a large openness, but there's no question that there are large numbers of Roman Catholics as well as Protestant Christians who are nervous and uncomfortable about anything that comes outside of their own tradition. Whereas I've found that, and I think I say this in the opening of the book, that I found when I came back to Christianity that almost instinctively or without thought, that certain images or certain meditations from my Buddhist practice would just arise. I mean, some of these Buddhist meditations are perfectly suited to thinking about loving in the way Christ invites a Christian to love. And and the other thing I think we have to keep in mind here is that there's an enormous difference in the dialogue that goes on among theologians of different faith traditions than prayers and meditators in different traditions. Right. And, when you're down at the level of practice, I think, you can see much more resonance of the experience between different faith traditions than when you're just dealing at the level of doctrine.
And I'm happy, I know it, I'm helpless.
Sorry for interrupting the conversation, but I have something I need to tell you about. You may or may not know this, but this podcast is produced in the city of Sulphur, Louisiana, one of the sister cities that make up Southwest Louisiana. All of my childhood memories are wrapped up in the city of Sulphur. It's my home, and it's been a good home for most of my life. There is a growing diversity of unique businesses, services, and events in Sulphur, each with a rich and colorful story to tell about their particular place in this little jewel on the west side of the Calcasieu River. My mission is to promote good news, to put a positive signal out in the world. That's why my team at Parker Brand Creative Services has created the new brand, Sulphur Today. Here's how it works. Post your Sulphur event, service, photos, videos, or information using the hashtag Sulphur Today. That's it. My team and I will scan and curate those posts through the social media platforms we've put in place. Before you make your post, just type hashtag. That's a £sign for the folks that don't know what a hashtag is. And the words Soul for Today with no space. My team at Parker Brand is monitoring this tag right now, and they're ready to create positive digital curb appeal for our city by sharing all the very best Sulphur has to offer through the Soul for Today social media pages. As the Soul for Today project grows, we will be scheduling interviews and video sessions with businesses, events, and services so they can tell their story of Soul for Today in a series of ongoing micro-documentaries. Look for the eye-catching Soul for Today sign when you're out and about. And be ready, we may be stopping by to visit you for a photo op. And don't forget to stop by the Parker Brand Creative Services studio in Sulphur to grab a Soul for Today decal for your vehicle or business. We want people visiting our area to know that they can find all the wonderful things we have to offer with ease and be a part of our history by utilizing the Soul for Today pages or by searching the Soul for Today hashtag. Do you want to help us tell the story of Soul for Today? Here's what I need you to do right now. Visit and like the Facebook page at facebook.com/Sulphur Today. And be sure to share positive sulfur information and post often using the hashtag Sulphur Today. Now, back to Find the Good News.
I love you just as well.
Yeah, see, that's what I found was happening with me. I love people. I love engaging with people, and I love spending time with people and learning about their uniqueness. And even when it comes to whatever they believe their faith tradition might be or whatever they're practicing, I'm always very curious. You know, how is that affecting your life? How is that connecting you with other people in the world and engaging you with in love and compassion towards your fellow man or whatever that may be? But what I found for me, I've spent a lot of my life having to first prove that it was okay for me to be practicing the way I was practicing. I felt like I was spending a lot of energy doing that first before I could even get to the real connection. And often the connection wouldn't happen because it felt like there was a barrier that was built up right there that we just couldn't seem to get over. And I think a lot of that might just have to be with where I live, honestly.
I was just going to say, that's not been my experience, but that might, in some sense, be the difference between living in New York or in the Twin Cities, in Minnesota, where I'm now living, and living in Southwest Louisiana.
Yeah, right. It's a little bit different here. Now, granted, I'm not going to say it's been, I'm not going to say it's not been hateful. I mean, I was a little discouraged. I'll give you the short version. When I was, and I would call it a mystical type experience, when I felt myself being drawn to the Catholic Church, I can remember taking my wife to lunch and telling her what was going on, and she was like looking at me aghast. Like, she grew up Catholic, but she was going, I can't believe I'm hearing you say these things. Like, after everything I know about you, why in the world would you be gravitating toward that? I said, well, I got to be honest with you. I said, this isn't an intellectual type thing. I am not reading a book that's saying, oh, I'm convinced now that this is the truth. It had nothing to do with this. This is very experiential. And I feel like I'm being drawn to this, to Catholicism. And so when I entered, I think I had rose-colored glasses on. I mean, I was really just drawn, and this in the truth of what you said, just prayer and meditative spaces, I was being drawn towards the heart of Jesus. That's just literally as simple as I could say it, and that felt like home. It was when I started to encounter my brothers and sisters who didn't have an experiential faith, but more of an intellectual faith, that I ran into some barriers where some real hateful type things arose. And it really shocked me. I was like, how do these things come out of a space that is surrounded a burning, bleeding heart? I just couldn't quite make peace with that. I'm still struggling with it, to be honest with you. Yeah. So that's been kind of my experience.
And I think there are those elements within the Catholic Church as well as in other Christian churches. And I guess for myself, coming back to Catholicism after 20 years of practicing Buddhism, I mean, I would say that I view my primary identity as Christian disciple. I worship in a Catholic church because that was my home when I was young, and it feels like home. And this goes to one of the point you made earlier, that I do think there's something different that happens in communal worship and engagement than in individual prayer and meditation. So I do find personal value in being part of a faith community, albeit an imperfect one. And, I feel like about every 6 or 8 months I go through one of these, why am I Catholic?
Oh, yeah, okay.
And maybe the answer is because the disciples give Jesus at the end of the Bread of Life discourse in the 6th chapter of John, like, where else would I go?
Yeah.
But none of this stuff is perfect. But the question, I guess, is how you ultimately identify yourself. And as I say, for me, coming back to this, when I was struck with this sense of coming back to God, it was coming back to God in Christ. And so that's how I view my primary identity.
Yes.
But, I'm part of the Catholic Church. That was the church of my youth. I don't see any point in finding another Christian community to be part of.
I get that. That makes sense. See, I wish I had that experience, honestly. I mean, listening to you, and in reading your book too, I got that experience, and honestly, it made me happy and it gave me a lot of joy. I haven't had that experience here, and I think, again, I've just come to believe that it has a lot to do, as you seem to agree too, that it's just where I happen to live. Because, see, I've been on several retreats, and I'll just give you an example, and it's kind of negative, but I'll just tell you the way it happened. I went on a retreat, and a men's retreat, and in the whole retreat, there was this whole almost like an agenda that I wasn't aware of. I went there for a different reason, but what the agenda seemed to be is to get men to go back home and get their families in line.
Oh, wow.
Like get their families in line.
That's pretty disconcerting.
Yeah. And so I didn't really enjoy that. And I left there, and okay, there's got to be more to this. And so I started going to some of the small groups. A lot of retreats will have small groups that break out. And so in going to the small group, like one of my third maybe experiences, I was still in the initiate stage, I guess, of this, where it's like, hey, we're getting to know you. And one evening, one of the men that was leading the group had asked me, so what they had heard I was a convert. They were calling me the convert, in the group. And I said, okay, well, I'm a convert. And they were like, oh, where did you used to go to church? And when I said, well, the short answer is I practice Buddhism. And I wrote it down because this is what he said. He said, well, it's good that we've drawn you away from all of that satanic stuff. And I really was aghast. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I went home, and that was where my conflict began, because I thought, how am I going to do this when it was very strange. I felt like Christ was drawing me into a strange predicament.
No, that would be pretty off-putting. Yeah.
So you're being drawn in, but at the same time you're being repelled. And I said, okay, I'm having a hard time. And so what I've come to call myself, very similar to you, as I go, I'm a brother, is what I've just come to believe of myself, a brother and a child of God. And when I can practice Catholicism, I almost have to practice privately. The community aspect just hasn't worked out for me.
Right.
And that's unfortunate, because
that is unfortunate. It really is.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask you is what the value of that is to you in Buddhism and Catholicism, in those dual experiences. What was that like for you, community? Is that something that was very important in both of those?
When I was living in Buddhist communities in Nepal and India, and in some sense that was part of the difficulty, because neither country is itself a Buddhist country. Westerners there were subject to visa restrictions, and so for me, one of the difficulties precisely was that we were always back and forth. I always, I could be in Nepal for a while, then I'd travel to India a while, and so maybe you and I would meet at Kopan Monastery in Kathmandu. We'd be together a couple of days, and you're going off one place, I'm going off another, and so there was community, but not stable community. And that I did find hard. I mean, leaving aside other things like the difficulty of the physical conditions there. Sure. But it was not stable community. And ultimately that was something that I missed. And coming back to the States, though, was a much broader issue about, I was living in Tibetan communities that could barely support themselves, let alone Westerners. And so, I had been a lawyer before. There was a limit to how long I thought I could stay out of the States and still earn a living. But I found it hard to find a Buddhist community that worked well for me when I moved back to the States. And part of that, leave aside whether this was a good thing or not, whether it was a prideful ego thing or not, but that when I first came back, I had almost the sense that a lot of the Buddhist places in the States are kind of Buddhist light.
Yeah, okay, I get that.
And so I did find it hard to find a community that I was happy with. So I felt in some sense where I was a little bit isolated in my last years as a Buddhist back in the United States.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, because I've always kind of been, and whether it's, I don't know why, maybe it's just some conditioning, but I've always been a little bit apprehensive of trends, and I've watched Buddhism become very trendy in our culture, and get sort of thrown in with sort of some new age activities, or get labeled as sort of like, oh, that's it's cool to do, to pick and choose and pluck from, and wear beads and things like that. You know what I mean? It's become like something you can wrap yourself in and sound very peaceful. But when I think about it, for me, a lot of it, and Christianity too, my Christian faith, both of those are mostly practiced on my front porch. You know what I mean? Like, that's where it really works for me, like in the world that I'm actually living in, not so much in a temple. I love going to those sacred spaces. But the reality is they have to work for me in traffic, and they have to work for me when I'm shopping, or whenever I'm, talking to someone. I mean, those things are, to me, that's where it all matters the most. And I find a lot of times in a fundamentalist culture that I kind of live in on the coast, that's less important than just doing things the way you're told to sort of do them. Make sure you're going to all
I would say, or to say you believe the things that you're supposed to believe. You check the box of, and as I say, my own spirituality is heavily Ignatian, after the Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuits, and his emphasis is precisely on finding God in all things, and on discerning how I'm uniquely being called to build God's kingdom right here, right now.
So you've obviously went through the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius then. So
I made them myself, and I direct other people doing them as well.
You do? Okay.
Yeah.
What is that like? What was that like for you when you first did the exercises, and now sharing that with other people? What have you seen?
For me, it was absolutely life-changing. I mean, it was, I made the traditional way of making the exercises is in a 30-day residential retreat. But Ignatius, even at the time he wrote the exercises, recognized that it wasn't always easy for people, even in his time, to absent themselves from their lives for a month. And so I made them the way many lay people make them today, in what's called a retreat in daily living, over the course of 8 months, where you meet weekly with a director, one-on-one, and then are given prayer material every day. And as I said, it was life-changing. It was really that experience, during that experience, that I discerned my own call to train as a spiritual director and in retreat house ministry. And so it really is not an exaggeration to say that experience changed my life completely.
So, as I understand, I've never done the exercises. I've read about them, and I follow many Jesuits online, actually, because I tend to find that voice seems to speak to me. And as I understand, there's some imaginative exercises, right, where you engage your imagination heavily. Can you kind of just describe that? Because there's maybe a lot of people listening that don't really know what that is. Sure.
And I mean, the premise that I think Ignatius works under is that God will use anything to get our attention, and that includes using our imagination and our dreams and everything else and other people. And so, not exclusive. There are some considerations in particular meditations, but a not insignificant part of the prayer in the spiritual exercises is praying with gospel scenes out of the life of Jesus, and he encourages a way of praying with Scripture. Obviously, there's lots of ways to pray with Scripture, but a way where you actually put yourself right in the gospel scene and set the scene, read the passage, set the scene, put yourself in it somewhere, and then simply allow it to unfold. Now, to be clear, you're not people sometimes get confused about this idea of using your imagination. You're not making up the story. You're letting God speak through your imagining of this experience.
Okay. I can see that. That's pretty fascinating. I have another guest who talks heavily, who's been on and talks heavily about imagination. Now, his experience, I'll just quickly share it with you. He had a debilitating disease. He was bedridden. And since he was laying in bed and he was bedridden, he found some teachings exploring God through imagination. Now, they weren't Ignatian. I believe it was Neville Goddard. And so he explored these practices engaging God through his imagination, and he began imagining himself in situations that would imply that he was healed. And I know him personally. This is really what happened to him over a period of time after doing these exercises and believing that these things were happening, that he had to be healed to do these things. One day he gets up and it's all gone.
Wow. Completely
healed. And so it's changed his life. Not only physically is he healed, but it's also completely reworked his whole worldview. In his relationship to God, so I find when I hear that about Saint Ignatius and those exercises, and then I hear what he's saying, I love seeing those sort of nodes where they cross over, and you go,
sure. Sure, and as you know from my book as well, in the Tibetan Buddhist Lamrim, which is the area of practice that I engaged in the most, it comes out of the Galupa tradition. In fact, I just this past weekend gave a 3-day retreat on parallels between the Tibetan Buddhist Lamrim and the spiritual exercises.
Oh, wow.
But that prayer system itself also makes tremendous use of imagination. And part of it is that both systems recognize, and this goes back to your point before about, what people say and believe, is that ultimately conversion is an experience of the heart. And these prayer exercises where I'm using imagination really have the potential to touch at a incredibly deep level that's much deeper than simply thinking about things.
Yeah.
And I talk in the book about some examples of basic Buddhist and Christian truths that, accepting them at the intellectual level is one thing, but really having a full, deep affective sense of them is a very, very different.
Yeah, right. I relate to everything you're saying right there. That's always been, when I went through RCIA, I remember I got in late, so I was a week or two late. I went to the third class, and when I walked in, I remember this very well. The first thing, a guy walked up to me and goes, "Hey," he goes, "I have the answers from the last 2 weeks if you just want to fill in the blanks. That way you can be all caught up." And I'm not making fun of him by saying that, but I remember going home and sharing with my wife. I said, "Wow," I said, "that's just not what I'm there for," and I feel alone. I don't know why, and it might be my own mind. I said, it could just be my own mind framing this up. So I started to feel very alone in the fill in the blanks environment.
And I've taught RCIA, and I make clear to people. I mean, I ran an RCIA program for a couple of years in a parish, and make clear to people that my interest is not here's the list of things you have to learn so you can stay your Catholic, but it really is about a commitment to active discipleship, right? And a living committed relationship with God.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if you don't have that, I don't really care what you label yourself. It doesn't make any difference.
Yeah. No, I agree. I'm in the same. I feel exactly the same way. One of the words that I've tended to lean towards in talking about that, and again, it's all built into the language of the faith, is the body of Christ, and it's an organism, and that you're kind of a shoot off of that body. And and something very attractive to me about being a Christian is the idea of sort of slowly allowing, or maybe even incredibly quickly allowing, the identity of Christ to eventually become your identity, essentially. Right. I mean, to join the body, Right.
Well, that's what Paul says, right? It's no longer I, but Christ who lives in me. That's the aspiration, right? So that I decrease and Christ increases.
Yeah, right. And that's very beautiful to me. I find great value in that type of language. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about today, which was very important to me, and it was one of the great treasures of this book, and I did not know it until I started reading it, that was really what I was going to hear about, was Tong Lin. And, I'll tell you briefly, my experience with that kind of came at the right time. My mother had cancer, and so I was spending a lot of time during that period going to all of her treatments with her, going to all of her doctor visits. So there was a lot of time sitting in uncomfortable waiting rooms. And so up until that point, I've got to be honest, I had kind of laid my spiritual life down for a brief bit. But for some reason, when I began taking her, I happened to go through my ridiculously large and chaotic book library. I think you and I may have talked about that online. I buy more books than I can read. But right. I had a book by Pema Chodron called When Things Fall Apart that I had bought 10 years prior. And I happened to write inside, remember that you bought this for yourself when you need it most. And I thought, well, that's funny. I left myself that note. I guess I'll just read this while I'm in the waiting room. And so she happened to be talking about Tonglen and Bodhicitta and compassion and all that. And I said, well, this is a great opportunity for me to practice this for myself and for my mother, while she's going through her treatments. And so I began practicing this Tonglen. And I wasn't calling myself a Buddhist, but I kept finding there was I kept gravitating towards this idea of the Sacred Heart of Jesus as I would do these practices, this sort of inflaming and glowing, but yet wounded. And anyway, there was sort of a mixture of imagination involved in there too. So when I got to your book, of course, I'm seeing this bridge right here, and that's what I saw this book as for me. I was like, oh, wow, this book just hits right into this territory of this particular type of prayer. So that's my spill on it, but I would love it if you could just share with the listeners what that is, how you discovered it, what it means to you, and how you've modified that for Christians.
Yeah, I mean, Tonglen, the word Tonglen is a Tibetan word that literally means giving and taking, which pretty much accurately describes what goes on in the meditation. And the goal of the meditation is to combat what Buddhists say is that our significant problems stem from our self-cherishing heart, right? That says, I'm more important than other things. I want my happiness. I want my freedom from suffering. And the goal of this meditation is to try to cut through that by intentionally effectively willing myself to take on the suffering of others. And so in the meditation, we tend to start with someone that we have feelings of love for, because it's easy to say, with someone I love, well, of course I would do anything to alleviate their suffering. And there are different ways of practicing it. In one way, I imagine as I'm inhaling, I imagine their suffering taking the form of black smoke or whatever in their body, and imagine myself as I inhale and taking that in and then breathing out to them, healing, white light and energy. And it's a hard practice to really do, because what you're really saying is, yes, I am willing to take on all of the suffering of someone. Now, most Buddhist lamas will say that, in the case of ordinary people, you're not actually taking their suffering from them. Although, we all know that all sorts of things have effect in it. But that primarily what's changed is yourself. It's that breaking that heart that says, I want to avoid my own suffering, and I'm willing to take on the suffering of others. It can be a very, very powerful experience. I actually that was one of the last meditations we did in this retreat. I just did this last week again. And I think people find it a very powerful experience.
I think that for me, Buddhism and Christianity both, that was always the core message for me, is to not run. Well, let me back up. I mean, Buddhism, of course, tells you life is suffering. There's a path that leads to the end of suffering. And then we see Christ enter into suffering. And so there's this strange dichotomy there that I always have found very attractive. I feel like both messages for me have worked well together. And when I was experiencing and praying that way with Tonglen, I would get that feeling of, and I know this may sound strange to some listeners, but this feeling of like, perhaps even this is what Christ may have feels like for all of us. Like, I take all your suffering upon me. I take all your sin upon me. And so for me, that particular prayer, I was like, this is incredible, because for just the briefest little, fraction, you can get into that mindset, that heart space. And so for me, the prayer was very Christian in that aspect.
Absolutely. And, the modifications that I make for my book are very minor. I mean, it's this sense, because Christians proceed from a premise that there's God that's effectively, it's God's love that I'm sharing. It's God's grace that I'm sharing. And so as a Christian, when I do that meditation, I start with, I'm breathing in God's love and God's love, whereas a Buddhist doesn't do that. But really, I mean, both Christianity and Buddhism seek a motivation that is for the benefit of others. They're both increasingly other-directed in their focus. And so what we speak of as agapic love in the Christian tradition, that self-sacrificing love for everyone without regard to what they do for me, is no different from what the Dalai Lama calls universal compassion, that mindset of bodhicitta, that says, I want salvation not for my own sake. I want enlightenment not for my own sake, but for the sake of all of the suffering beings. And so the ultimate mindset both traditions seek is the same.
Yeah. There's so much common, and I tend to prefer to focus on what's common, because you said something at the beginning of the talk that really jumped out at me, because I've had a lot of conversations where I hear people say, well, ultimately all religions are the same. They're all saying the same thing. And I'm not belittling anyone who has said that to me by what I'm about to say next. I've always felt like there's so much more that needs to be talked about when we make statements like that.
That's right.
Perhaps there's definitely common wisdom silos. I mean, right. that exist, but there are some huge differences as well.
And I'm happy, I know it.
I hate to pause the program, but I want to ask you something. Did you know that you can help me and my team at Parker Brand Creative Services grow the Find the Good News signal? For less than a fancy cup of coffee, you can become an Early Risers Club patron on our Patreon page. What's Patreon? Well, it's a way for creators to fund their projects by pooling support from those really passionate people that believe in what they're doing. Do you believe in what we're doing with Find the Good News? I hope you do. We believe that there's already enough negative news in the world, even right here at home, and that good people doing good works deserve a platform to speak from too. That's why we created Find the Good News, and we believe in that simple mission. Maybe you believe in it too. If you do believe in finding and sharing good news, then head over to our Patreon page right now or check out the link in the show description. For a commitment of $3.33 a month, you can join the Early Risers Club of Find the Good News Patreon supporters and get access to the B-Sides, a patrons-only podcast with the crew behind Find the Good News, Parker Brand Creative Services. Each time we level up, the Patreon rewards will get bigger. If you're tired of old news, bad news, and fake news, help support Find the Good News at patreon.com/findthegoodnews. That's patreon.com/findthegoodnews. Now, back to the episode.
That's right. I mean, look, all truth belongs to the Holy Spirit. So there is truth in many of these traditions, but one can't say Buddhism and Christianity are the same, because there's an enormous difference between a Buddhist meditator who believes my enlightenment is purely my own work, and my position, coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition that recognizes a role for God's grace, right? And so that, and when people ask me, for me, that's the fundamental difference between Buddhism and Christianity. This, who's doing the work? I'm doing it, but I'm doing it with God's grace. Whereas the Buddhists would say, no, this is just, I created the karma and it's all my work to do it. And that to me is, I think it doesn't help to say, oh, there's no differences, they're all the same. Right. There are the differences, but on the other hand, there's enough common, certainly in terms of the moral system, certainly in terms of some of the practices, certainly in terms of the mindsets that we're talking about here, to say I can benefit from looking at other traditions.
Yeah, I've something I've often struggled with, because see, I was raised in a Baptist church, so I didn't grow up in a Catholic framework. But the Baptist church put into me that there was this idea that. How do I say this? I'm trying to think of the right words. I almost said, that the gospel is meant to be shared. Okay. And that's not the right thing, because the gospel is meant to be shared. But from the way I was taught that, it wasn't really that, hey, you need to go teach someone about Jesus and the way he's showed you to live your life and to engage the world and be a full human being. What you need to do is go out and convince people that he is the Son of God, and they need to understand that so they can get into heaven. That was the way it was framed for me as a child, and that was as simple as it was. If I didn't believe anything else, as long as I believed that, I didn't need to do anything else. Right. As I got older, I felt like that was so rudimentary, and I just had a hard time. Wasn't that I had a hard time accepting divinity, or simplifying it down to that. I just had a hard time believing that was all there was to it, that we didn't need to do anything else. I felt like there's a whole world out there that we have to engage with. So from that perspective, when I would talk to someone from another faith, if I came at it from that perspective, it didn't matter. I had nothing to learn from them, so to speak. All I had to do was convince them of what I believed, so they would believe it too. I don't know if that makes sense. But so anyway, that was just something I struggled with as I moved away from that worldview. I said, okay, so now if I still believe these things, what do I do when I do engage with someone from another faith tradition that doesn't believe this at all? But I still see all the clear markers there that they, believe in loving the other as a self. They believe in helping humanity. They have love, compassion, all those things.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's just a little different.
I mean, look, the hope is, to me, evangelization to be effective is you want people to look at you and say, yeah, I want the Kool-Aid he's drinking. You know what I mean? Right. They want to know, it's one thing to say people look at your life and say, yeah, there's something there, which is very different from running around telling people if they don't believe what you believe, they're going to hell. Right. Well, true. Outside of my office here, there was a billboard for 6 months that said, it was big, just black and yellow letters, huge, and all my guests have seen it. It said, are you prepared to die? Right. And it was like needgod.com. That was the whole billboard, and people would pull up and go, man, that's pretty brutal. And I was like, yeah. So, and unfortunately, it's like that's kind of what I grew up with, really. That was the... Yeah, on the other hand, I will say, just to push back a little, right? I mean, both in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and, even in exercise, there's this sense of recognizing that my death could occur at any time. Yeah. And so it's meant as an impetus to practice in a way that I think can be very helpful. Yeah, you're right. So, that's true. Yeah. And because, so in that sense, there's something valuable in it because, and this is part of this Lam Rim that I mentioned before, right? This sense that we always have this illusion that I've got all this time for everything. And the reality is I could die at any moment. And intellectually we get those words, but that's not how we live our lives. Yeah. I mean, I live my life going, hey, I come from Southern Italian peasant stock. All the women in my family live till their 90s. I got another 30 years left. Well, we don't know that. We don't know I'll be alive by the time you have this podcast on your system, right? That's right. It's funny that you bring this up, and I'm smiling because anybody that is really close to me or been around me knows that I collect skulls, not real skulls, but skull artwork. I have skulls tattooed on me, even wear jewelry with skulls. And, to some, they see a skull and they go, oh, that's very frightening. And for me, it's exactly what you're talking. It's a memento mori reminder that you too may die, and it may happen at any moment. I've always had that sense. I mean, especially in my adult life, that, hey, these days are precious. This moment is precious, and I could really, it could happen. I could find out today that I have an illness, and I may not have much time left. You just never know. Have I lived well? And by lived well, I don't mean have I taken for me. I mean, have I lived well? Have I been a good human being? Right. And I think Christianity speaks to that a lot. I mean, for me, and so does Buddhism too. The one thing I wanted to kind of do with you, and this might be an interesting, maybe a strange experiment, but I wanted to put two words together and see what you had to say about those two words. And there was some things I'd read that you'd written that kind of made me think about this. So if I could say the word Avalokiteshvara and Christ to you, what do you have to say about those two things in juxtaposition to each other? Sure. Well, from a Buddhist perspective, Avalokiteshvara is the Buddha of compassion, is a bodhisattva. And so the Buddhists would say, well, Christ is a bodhisattva, right? Obviously, a traditional Christian tradition would be that Christ is more than that. So Christ is different. At the end of the day, I think everybody's got to answer the question as to who they think Christ is for themselves. And I think for some people, they might view it the same way as that. And for some, this idea of Jesus is God puts him on a completely different level from anyone else that we would. But certainly from a Buddhist perspective, Buddhists would say, yeah, Jesus Christ is the same as Avalokiteshvara or any of the other, enlightened beings.
I've always wondered about that because, I remember when I first started reading about bodhisattvas, I would kind of discovered the writings of Shantideva.
Sure.
And there were certain pieces of that, the bodhisattva's way of life that, honestly, I remember where I was when I heard them. I'm sure you've had experiences like that where you just read something and you go, this is hitting me in a different place. And it goes far beyond a Buddhist idea. It's sort of this bigger than the religion. And there were words within that just rung so true to me and hit me right at whatever we are. I just felt it. Yeah. And so I remember when I was in my 20s, I would go out every morning. I committed myself to learning for a certain section of it, learning a line a day until it rung true in my heart. And I remember telling people, I said, I know that some of these words are going to sound alien when I say them. I said, but when I say these words, all I can think about is Jesus. That's all I think about is Christ.
Absolutely. First of all, I think that's a wonderful book. I think Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, The Guide to a Bodhisattva's Way of Life, is wonderful for meditation purposes. And I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that in one of the talks I gave this weekend at the retreat, I kind of went through, and there are a number of bodhisattva vows that Tibetan Buddhists take at certain points. Okay. And I can line up on any number of those vows against the Beatitudes. And I think if there's a perfect illustration of what it means to live a life the way Christ invites us to, it's the Beatitudes. And, I can go through and go, here's this Beatitude and here's this Bodhisattva vow, here's this one. And so it's not surprising that you would read Shantideva and have that reaction. Yes. Do we going to have that reaction every single line in there? No. But there's a tremendous amount there, and that the beginning and end of that book, the kind of motivation and the dedication, which really is about total self-sacrifice and compassion for all beings. It's beautiful. We used it for our chanting on Saturday night. Wow. At this retreat. It's such beautiful sentiments. You know.
I find it flies in the face of the culture we live in today too.
Of course.
Yeah.
But so does Christianity. So does the life that Christ invites us to lead.
Yeah,
it's
right.
totally countercultural. Yeah.
I struggle with that now because there's so much information flying at us. In fact, that's part of what this show is all about, is trying to judo flip some of that energy that we have out in the world that's taking over all the media and the airwaves with negativity, and going, hey, look, how can we still tell the truth, but put a new stream of information out there that's positive and good that people can touch, Right. And they have some choices, at least, for good information. And I struggle with that. There is so much misinformation and negativity that is just flying at us every day. I have to have a practice that can bring me home, honestly, to some degree. Do you find that in your work, with people that there is almost like an anxiety in the world?
Well, certainly right now there's tremendous. I don't want to start getting into political discussions,
sure.
Obviously there's a tremendous amount of anxiety in the world, and whether it's at particular government policies or the climate issues, and there's a whole gun violence. There's a whole array of things that create tremendous anxiety in people, and that certainly comes up in people that I talk to on retreats or people that see me for spiritual direction. But yeah, and it's not at all surprising that it does. And at the end of the day, the question though becomes, where ultimately is my security? Yeah. And ultimately, my security is in God, regardless of. And one of the things I think that helps in Ignatian spirituality is the sense. I mean, the mindset Ignatius wants us to develop is, I don't express a preference for long life or short life, health or sickness, riches or poverty, honor or dishonor, because I recognize that everything has the capacity to deepen my life in God. And so to some extent, I have to say, even this current political situation, right, has the capacity, which is not always easy. But yeah, I think that if people don't have some kind of deepening connection with God, it's hard not to be almost disabled by the anxiety of the time in which we live.
Yeah, that's a good way to put that. It's interesting. Something sparked when you said that. I heard some commentary recently. One of the favorite scriptures that people like to throw out that I hear a lot is, give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to God what is God's, which is usually used as a encouragement to pay taxes to whatever the authorities are. But this commentary I heard the other day, and I don't remember exactly who it was, but I thought it was interesting. He said, well, I think there's a little bit of a trick in there, and Jesus is playing a little trick on us, because he said, he's, in the words of Jesus, he's saying, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And then the next question that's implied there is, well, what is God's?
Right. And he doesn't answer that. And the answer is everything's God's, right?
So, right.
I mean, St. Ignatius Suscipe, which is part of my prayer every day, is, take my liberty, my memory, my understanding, my entire will, everything I have, you've given me. And so I return it, because all I need is your love and grace, right? And if your starting point is it's all God's, right, that makes a big difference. It forces you to ask that question of, well, wait, what really does belong?
Right. Does anything actually belong? Right. Exactly to Caesar. Exactly. Yeah. It was interesting. It's an interesting thought to have and to really sit and contemplate on. And those are the types of things about meditating on scripture that I find fascinating, because sometimes it takes someone else to illuminate something for you, but sometimes you can sit with a piece of scripture and something else just comes out. And I'm sure that's the same way with the Ignatian exercises, right? I mean, when you're in these, imagining yourself in these scenes, I'm sure there may be details that jump out and you go, no, what's interesting that I'm seeing this time that I didn't see before.
That's right.
And you find a new piece of wisdom to glean.
Oh yeah, every once in a while I'm praying with a piece of scripture I've prayed with 47 zillion times before, and then go, wow, where did they add that line before? When did they add that line? I haven't seen that one before.
Yeah, no, I agree. I find things like that too, that I go, wow, how did this sit here? It's like it's that treasure that sits in front of you, and then it's just, you're not ready for it, perhaps, maybe, and it just cracks open. Or, what I loved about your book, and you said it just a minute ago, is the mystery element of grace. That's sort of like the unknown for me. A lot of times I find that just sneaks in. And I've told somebody before, I said, it's like a hot coal for me sometimes that just like burns inside of you, and it's like something is about to be born. I don't know what it is, but there's going to be an action or a doing that is a little out of my control. That sounds a little crazy the way I worded that, but it's like something, like a motivation, a burning in your belly to, a nudge, a spiritual nudge that's coming from somewhere that's just, you don't know. For me, it happens a lot. I think that's
Holy Spirit, and I can't explain it, right?
Right. I think I remember saying that. I came out of a retreat a couple of years ago, and I said that to, there was a priest I hadn't seen in a while, and I remember it was another one of those weird experiences where I said, man, am I in the right place? Because he said, well, Oran, I haven't seen you in a while. And I said, well, I said, I went on a retreat, and I said, and the Holy Spirit's been moving. I've been doing some other things that just feels like where I'm supposed to be right now. And he was giving me a quizzical look, and I said, what's the matter? And he said, what do you mean by the Holy Spirit is moving? And I was like, okay. I'm confused right now. I think he and I just weren't, again, it was that he wanted an intellectual answer and I couldn't put it in a bottle.
Well, that's right. That's right.
I said, I don't have a container for this, what I'm trying to explain. So I can't put it in a bottle and stick a label on it and hand it to you. I don't know how to say it. All I can say is weird stuff's happening. I did note on your website that you said you were doing a follow-up book to this book.
Yeah, it's been sitting. I don't remember when the last time I worked on it was, so I should probably change that on my website. No, I did start a couple years ago writing a book about conversion and about my conversion from Catholicism back, and then it it just was backburnered for a while, and then I started writing a book on the spiritual exercises, and that started to feel like work. And so I probably have partial manuscripts of 3 books sitting around, and I have really just put most of my energy recently into actually just giving retreats and doing spiritual direction. So it may be that sometime the time will be right to get back to one of those, but it's just not happening right now.
Well, you do keep your blog up to date. I mean, updated. And I read your recent post. I think it was about that, actually.
Yeah.
I felt like, and I kind of wanted to talk about that. I mean, I seem to have that conversation over and over again with people on this show, is that, leaning into who you are sometimes is the best thing. I mean, now granted, if there's some toxic things that you don't want to lean into, but leaning into like the best version of yourself, I've struggled with that my whole life, and sensing that there's better parts of myself that I should probably allow to leak through the membrane a little more than the parts that I tend to embrace the most. And reading that, your last blog post, I mean, I felt like that was in that territory. I was like, that's a good piece of advice, is you really need to go all in with the gifts that you have. And
absolutely.
And so, if you're you said it feels like work. Sometimes we know, you just go, man, this just isn't the right tributary to be on right now. I need to jump back in the river.
Yeah, and in some sense, it's none of it's wasted. I mean, I end up using a lot of stuff that was, in the book I started drafting on the exercises. Well, that stuff comes out, and when I give Ignatian retreats all the time, so that stuff's there. I talk about conversion quite a bit. So, none of it's ever wasted. It's just a question of whether it'll ever see light of day in published form the way Growing in Love and Wisdom did.
Yeah, no, well, that's a beautiful book. Do you encourage people to seek out knowledge about other faiths?
I kind of take my cue from what people are interested in, and it's not surprising that some people that come to me for spiritual direction come because they have been between traditions. That's not exclusively true. I get some people that are purely Ignatian or Catholic in their approach, but there's no question there are some people that seek me out because that is their interest. As a spiritual director, my job is not to push or prod someone in any direction. It's to kind of stand in that neutral space that allows God to work with that person. Sure.
Well, I mean, I don't have a spiritual director. Struggled with that for a while, and I've often wondered about that. As a spiritual director, do you probably encounter that? Most people are bringing you real life, ordinary things that they're dealing with every day. It's not some big, heavy spirit. I mean, what I would call a classical spiritual problem, like I don't like reading scripture, or I mean, that's probably there too, but it's probably more just real life stuff, like, hey, marital problems, dealing with children, dealing with the loss of a loved one, illness. I mean, those are all spiritual problems.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no, especially if your starting point is an Ignatian spirituality that finds God in everything, there's no clean bifurcation between life with God and rest of life, right? It's all life with God. So, my own view is that anyone who is a serious prayer or serious about deepening their awareness of God's presence and action in their life benefits from spiritual direction, because we benefit from having someone to talk to about our experience. So now it's true that some people look for a spiritual director because they're discerning something specific. So a couple of years ago, I had a young woman who was discerning whether to enter religious life. And so she came to me for spiritual direction. But often it's just people that they regularly pray, they regularly meditate, and they want to have a place, a container, a place to talk about what's going on and help someone deepen what's going on in their lives.
No, that would, I can imagine that's really quite lovely. I mean, I would say I find that in my life and my wife and the people that come to this table, and maybe a select few friends where I can get really intimate and talk openly. I can see where it would be a great benefit, though, to sit with somebody as a spiritual director who has a working knowledge of whatever your faith you're in, too, to where you can just draw from those things and give you something to apply, point you in the right direction towards resources and things like that. Yeah. Are there any resources that you advise, often, that you recommend often to people, like books or audio resources or anything like that? I said books.
Looking around. Right, depends on what purpose, right?
Yeah, right, right.
There are a number of great books introducing people to ignition spirituality and their exercises. Bill Barry, who's a Jesuit, has several books that are really good as just an introduction to this spirituality generally. When there are people that I don't want to say this name. I want to say people who have a mature spirituality, but that's going to sound wrong to the people that don't. But I find Richard Rohr's writings very helpful for people, particularly people who have expanded beyond a kind of restrictive notion of their faith. Tradition. So
that's a good choice. I agree with that. I mean,
and earlier you mentioned, of course, Thomas Merton, who for me at the time when I was struggling with my, where I was with God, was extremely helpful to me. I think I have a shelf and a half of Merton's books downstairs, but I've seen maybe more than anyone actually needs. But
well, you've referenced Merton quite a bit, and that for me again was the original connector for me. And anybody that's reading Merton, if you're reading Merton and you find out someone's reading a lot of Merton, most of the time it's not because they're just doing some kind of book report. I mean, they're actually something's happening. Merton moves. For me, he spoke in a language that I say speaks because I'm still reading him. It feels like it's strange with him. For me, I know he's gone, but I told somebody this the other day. I said, out of all the authors I've read, for me, when I read Merton, I feel like he's still with us. I don't know why. I just get that really deep, visceral connection with what he's writing. And quite often, I feel like he's reading my mind sometimes, because he was openly struggled with things, and he was so honest and raw, which I loved.
Yeah. And then you mentioned two other people before. I love Thich Nhat Hanh's work, and particularly he has a couple books about Buddhism and Christianity, Living Buddha, Living Christ, and what's the other one? I think it's called Jesus and Buddha as Brothers or something like that.
That's it. Going Home is what it's called. That's right.
And
Jesus
some of the Dalai
Brothers.
Lama stuff is just wonderful. So, if anything, it's not that there's a shortage of stuff to read. It's just way too much. But what I always tell people is, again, why are we reading this stuff? Am I just trying to fill my head with more intellectual knowledge, or am I reading some of this stuff and really sitting with it and allowing it to really affect who I am?
Yeah, I definitely find that I as I've gotten older, I've struggled with that. When I was young, I was, and especially young, and trying to understand this sort of spiritual experience that I had, I was hungry to go. I needed a lot of perspectives because I was trying to frame up a mystery. I was like, I felt like I was on detective mode, like, okay, let me find other individuals out there who've had a similar experience. Maybe their experience will tell me what's going on. And so that was one thing led to the other. So I was a little hungrier. I had a lot more time, didn't have as many kids. There was a lot more going on, a lot less going on in my life. So it allowed for that. As I've gotten older, I find exactly what you said. I need to stay with a book and really just read it and let it soak in and try to apply what I'm reading in a different way. This episode's Fishing for Goodies fishbowl sponsor is Brimstone Museum and Henning Cultural Center in Sulphur, Louisiana. I don't know what you look for when you travel, but one of the things I look for when I'm putting together my itinerary is a unique museum or gallery in the city I'm traveling to. I do this almost every time I go to a new city, but if I'm being honest, I'm guilty of not always doing that very thing right here at home in Sulphur, Louisiana. That's really a shame because we have one of the most interesting, historically relevant, and culturally rich corners in any city in the country about 2 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. I'm talking about the Brimstone Museum and Henning Cultural Center. Have you ever really thought about why our city is named Sulphur? They've got a permanent exhibit on the history of the sulfur industry that answers that simple question and more. You really get a full scope of just how important the sulfur mining industry was to the development of Southwest Louisiana and the impact it had on the rest of the world. Yes, the rest of the world. On the same property, right next door to the museum, is the Henning Cultural Center, presenting some of the most interesting, modern, and culturally relevant local art shows I've ever seen. My dear friend Tom Trahan and the Brimstone Historical Society have really worked hard to give us this treasure, and it's a multifaceted jewel that I plan to take advantage of more often. You don't have to wonder what their hours are, or how to get there, or what shows are coming up. Just go to brimstonemuseum.org like I did, and subscribe to their mailing list right there on the homepage. That's brimstonemuseum.org. Tom will make sure you start getting the announcements for each and every new show at the gallery. But you don't have to wait for the mail to arrive to enjoy this historical local treasure. You don't have to be guilty, like me, of overlooking a local wonder that conveniently sits next to the Grove, one of the most beautiful walking parks in Southwest Louisiana. Drop in and say hi to Tom for me. Tour the museum and center, and make sure to tell Tom that you heard about Brimstone Museum on Find the Good News. Now, let's take that dive in the fishbowl. Well, this has been really great. I've taken up an hour of your time. There is one tiny little part of the show we call the fishbowl. I didn't know I was going to get to show you video, but this is the fishbowl. So I don't know if you've listened to the show or not, but we have the last part of the show is called Fishing for Goodies, and this is where I give up my interviewing mode to this bowl right here. And so each guest draws 3 questions. Typically they draw them themselves, but since you're not here, I'm going to draw them for you, and I've actually already pulled 3 of them out before we started talking. And so if you don't mind, we're just going to go through these and have a little discussion about these 3 questions. So the first question I drew is this. It says, describe the last time you misjudged a situation and what you learned from it.
Yikes.
I know, right? It's like, dang, that's a big one.
Yeah, the problem is I'd have to sit with that one for a long time there.
Yeah. Well, can I reframe it though? Has there ever been something where, and bring it maybe more home to our conversation, has there ever been anything in when you chose Buddhism, I would say, I'm going to put it that way, that you had a misconception about and you went, oh, this isn't what I thought it was? Or even Christianity, Catholicism, was there something that you went, this isn't quite the way this isn't quite what I remember or the way I understood it?
Yeah, and what I would say in Buddhism is one of the things that attracted me to Buddhism was the Buddha's insistence that you don't accept things merely because someone tells you it, but because it is the product of your experience. And one of the things ultimately that was my problem in staying in the Tibetan Buddhist community I was in, is that many people, and this was particularly true of many of the Westerners, just whatever the Lama said, period.
Yeah.
That's what they said. And that to me was very counter to my understanding of, really counter to what attracted me to Buddhism in the first place.
Yeah, no, I agree. In fact, I find sometimes that particular teaching from the Buddha, put it to the test, probably has caused me a lot of problems with making friends in the local parishes, because I've never there's a lot of people that grew up in the church and have stayed in the parish and they've been with one priest perhaps, will say, hey, whatever Father says is the way it is. Right. And I just immediately, for me, that sends up a flag. Not that there's any reason to not trust that priest. I just immediately go, well, shouldn't we put this to the test and at least let's see if it's applicable and real and true, and do a little digging. I don't just take it as a total faith value. And so that I've struggled with that, to be honest. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's caused me a little grief.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, thanks. That was a good little twist on that, on a question that was a little difficult, actually. I don't know what I would have said to that one either. Okay. So here's question number 2. What is something you think everyone should do at least once in their lives?
Go on pilgrimage.
Yes.
Yeah, I walked the Camino de Santiago 5 years ago or 6 years ago, I can't remember. And it was a really, really powerful experience. So whether it's a short pilgrimage or a long pilgrimage, to just kind of, absent yourself from the ordinary and carry what you minimally need and go off. And if short of that, if you can't at least do that, then at least go on retreat somewhere for, 8 days, or as an Ignatian I do try to do an 8-day retreat every year. And I do think as important as I think daily prayer and meditation is, there is something about pulling yourself out of ordinary time and really having that concerted time with God.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I guess it's strange, and not to get too deep off on it, but every year I take one little 3-day retreat that I've kind of made for myself, and I've been doing it for almost 25 years, and I go to the place where I had that experience when I was younger, and I'm still going and still asking questions 25 years later, and I've watched the world change around that place, but I go there by myself. I don't bring people with me because I need it. I need to go and get into that space where and lay the world down for a little while and just sort of be alone with my own being and still asking questions. I've learned some things, but I've made some mistakes, and I'm also still learning some things. I guess that's the part of the beauty of a retreat. Absolutely. Good. All right, last question.
All right.
Conversations you want to have with blank. So is there anybody that you would just love to have a conversation with about a particular thing, and who is that person? It could be anybody.
Living or dead?
Living or dead.
Yeah, probably someone who is more complicated. I like Stephen Hawking's in terms of his understanding of where God or not God in his way of thinking.
Right.
I don't know if that would be the only one, but it's funny. It's funny that's the first name that popped into mind.
I love that because most people want to have a conversation with people that sort of reaffirm their own thinking or maybe satiate a curiosity. That's an interesting choice because it's sort of a polarized view. I mean, he has a great understanding of the physical nature of the universe and all these theories, these wonderful theories, but yet a hard-boiled atheist.
Yeah.
So that would be a very interesting conversation. I don't know. My initial answer to that, a few other people have had a similar question on the show. And for me, my initial answer, I've lost my father a few years ago. And so immediately I just think of him. I go, I would love to just have, now that some time has passed and I've had time to really meditate on him but I still have lots of questions to really sit just for a while and have that conversation, answer some, scratch those itches. Well, I have one last question, and it's on the back of a coffee mug, and this is the final question I ask every guest. I'm going to send you this mug, so I'll need to get your shipping information.
Okay.
But on the back, it says, "Did anything good happen today?"
Well, part of my daily prayer, part of my daily examen is always, what are the things you're most grateful for today? And so the first thing I did today after I left the house was see my own spiritual director, and that's always a good thing for me. Oh, wow. So
man. Spiritual directors have spiritual directors.
Absolutely.
That's right.
In fact, the ethical guidelines under which I operate include that I myself am in spiritual direction.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful.
Which makes sense, doesn't it? I mean,
it really, really does. Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. We all need somebody. No matter where we're at or what stage in our life we're in. That's beautiful.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a huge treat for me. I was honestly a little nervous. I'm not going to lie. After reading your book and listening to so much of your podcast actually is travels with me every time I go on retreat. That's what I listen to driving there and back. So it's a great source for me. Is there what are the places that people should find you, connect with you if you want them to?
Well, my website is pretty easy because it's my name, susanstabile.com. And the blog Creo on Dios is linked on the website. And actually on the website, I also have some videos of some talks I've given that have not, that maybe are not in the podcasts or otherwise. But and I think the podcasts are all on iTunes as well. In fact, I know they are. They're all on iTunes too. So it's not that hard. It's not hard to find.
Right.
Not hard to find it.
No, I'll put some links in the show description, but this has been a real treat. Thank you for your time.
I love you just
Thanks for listening to My Beacon Series conversation with Susan Stabile. If you found something of use in this visit, consider helping me spread the good news by supporting the show at patreon.com/findthegoodnews. I thank you for your time, your love, and for pressing play.